Hello and welcome to this lesson, which is going to be about multiplication and division of integers, which corresponds to exercise 1G. So after I go through these notes, that's what you're going to be going through, exercise 1G. Our learning intentions: to understand that the product or quotient of two integers will be positive if the two integers have the same sign. To understand that the product or quotient of two integers will be negative if the two integers have opposite signs. And finally, to be able to find the product and quotient of two or more integers. So let's begin by going through the theory here. Now, whenever you see the word product, what I want you to put on top of that, just so you always remember, is the word product just means the result of multiplication. And then whenever you see the word quotient, just put a division sign there, because a quotient means the result of division. So make sure you put those on so that you're familiar with those words, product and quotient. Now, the product or quotient of two integers of the same sign is a positive integer. What that means is a positive times a positive is positive. Positive divided by a positive is positive. Negative times a positive is positive. Negative divided by a negative is positive. So as you can see there, and you might even want to color code this a bit better than what I have. Let's color code it a bit better. What we could say here is that whenever we have the same sign, so same, we get positives out. When we come to the alternative here, so let's now read this. What this says is that the product or quotient of two integers of opposite signs is a negative integer. So what this means is that if I have a positive times a negative, I get a negative out. If I have a positive divided by a negative, I get a negative out. If I have a negative times a positive, I get a negative out. And if I have a negative divided by a positive, I get a negative out. So what I really want you to take a note of here is that the signs are different. And when the signs are different, I get negatives out. So when the signs are the same, I get a positive out. When the signs are different, I get negative outs. All right, that might seem a bit abstract at the moment. Let's go into some examples here. So the first example that we have here is 3 times negative 7. Now, here's the important thing I want to tell you. When you're doing questions like this, so you're multiplying, you got negatives, what I want you to actually do is just ignore the negatives at first. All right, just ignore them. Tell me, what is 3 times 7? Well, it's 21. Now that you've done that, you're going to say, well, if this is positive and this is negative, well, these are opposite, so this must be negative as well. So I'll put a negative sign there. So the answer is negative 21. Let's do another example. So again, what you're first going to do is just ignore the signs. Just ignore them and go, what is 4 times 12? Well, that's 48. Then go back and say, well, if this is negative and this is negative, this is going to be positive. So that means I don't put a negative sign there, I walk away. Let's go through the next one. Again, what you do is you ignore the signs at first and you just go, what is 3 times 8? Well, 3 times 8 is 24. Now, if this is negative and this is positive, they're different. So I know this is going to be a negative here. So I put a minus sign in front of it. Let's come to this one right here. What is 2 times 5? Well, that's 10. Now, if this is negative and this is negative, this is going to be positive. So I just leave it like that. I don't put a negative sign in front of it. So the moral of the story, when you're doing these questions, ignore the sign at first, and then later go back and see what the sign is going to be. So here I would go, well, 40 divided by 10 is going to be 4. And if I've got one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative, because a negative and a positive make a negative. And then after a while, you can start doing these really quickly. You can go 63 divided by 7 is 9. And because I have one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. I'll come to the next one and I'll go 30 divided by 5 is 6. And because they're both negatives, I know my answer is going to be positive. So I just leave it as is. And then here again, 121 divided by 11 is going to be 11. And because they're both negative, I know my answer is going to be positive. So as you can see here, I'm first dealing with the numbers, just doing the calculation, then going back and seeing what my sign is going to be. That is the important part right there. Okay, let's calm down here now. What this says is work from left to right to evaluate. So let's do that now. All right, so if I'm working left to right, I'm going to first do this calculation. What is negative 2 times 9? Well, that's going to be negative 18. And then I'm just going to copy down everything else that I have there. Then I'm going to do this. What is negative 18 divided by negative 3? Well, 18 divided by 3 is 6. And because they're both negatives, it's going to be positive. And then I just copy down what I have there. And now this is my final thing I need to do here. 6 times 5 is 30. And because it's negative, I've got a negative there. So again, I'm doing the calculation, then going back to see what the negative or positive is going to be. Pause the video and you can give this one a go for yourself. What I'm first going to do is 4 times negative 10 is negative 40, divided by negative 2 times 5. Then I'm going to do this. 40 divided by 2 is 20, and because they're both negative, it's positive, and then I copy down the last bit there. This is going to be 100. So this is going to be 100 right there. This is going to be negative 30. Perfect. Hopefully all that made sense. The last thing that I want to go through here is questions in which you have to find a missing number. So you have to find a missing number to make sense out of the equation that we've been given here. Now, I've said using algebra, and we'll slightly touch on this, but for now, you can pretty much do this just by inspection. And by inspection, I mean just kind of looking at it and figuring it out. Now, again, what you're first going to do is just ignore the signs. Ignore them. Don't worry about the positives and negatives at first. Just ask yourself the question, 3 times what will give you 9? 3 times what will give you 9? You know it's going to be 3. Now, if our answer is negative 9, this must have to be negative 3, because a positive and a negative will give me a negative out. If it was just 3 times 3, it would be positive 9. So that has to be negative there. Perfect. Let's go on to our next one. So what we would do is I would say, ignore the signs. What 4 times what will give me 48? Well, I know that's going to be 12. Now, let's figure out if it's going to be positive or negative. Well, if this is negative and this is negative, this must be positive in order to make sense out of it. So we walk away. Next, again, ignore the signs. 7 times what will give me 35? My answer is going to be 5. Now let's check what the sign is going to be. Well, if this is negative and this is negative, this has to be positive in order to get a negative out here. Hopefully that made sense. And I might just pause here for a moment and show you another technique which kind of touches upon later on when we start using algebra a little bit. So it's a little bit like algebra here. What you could do, another way of finding these missing numbers, is you could take this, negative 9, and divide it by this right here, 3. And what I'm going to end up with is negative 9 divided by 3. Well, that's going to be negative 3. And that is what I got right there. Now, the reason why this works, dividing, is because division is the opposite of multiplication. So it's kind of like working backwards. We're going to have a big, long discussion on this in another unit called equations when we talk about this more. So if I was to do it again here, if I took negative 48 and I divided it by negative 4, well, a negative and a negative are a positive, and 48 divided by 4 is 12. And as you can see there, that's what I got. If you wanted to, you could try it for this one as well. But as you can see, that's just kind of a shortcut. And the reason why it works is dividing is the opposite of multiplication. So it's just a way of working backwards. And we'll talk more about it later. But for now, and for this topic, you can really do these just by inspection, just by looking at them and going, what times 5 is going to give me negative 40? Well, remember, forget the signs for the minute. What times 5 will give me 40? That's going to be 8. Now, in order for it to be negative 40 here, it must be negative 8. If we come to our next one here, what times 3 will give me 27? That's going to have to be 9. But let's just wait for a second. If this is a positive out and this is a negative, this must be a negative as well. A negative times a negative is a positive. That's how it worked there. And then finally, over here, so we're going to ask ourselves, what times 8 gives me 24? That's going to be 3. And if this is negative and this is negative, this has to be positive. And that's how it works. And again, if we wanted to use that technique that we saw above, we would take this negative 40. we would divide it by this 5. Negative 40 divided by 5 is negative 8. And that's what we see there. So a nice little trick if you were struggling just to figure it out by looking at it. You could say, if you couldn't figure this out just by looking at it, what you could do is say, let's take this number, let's divide it by this number. 27 divided by negative 3 is going to be negative 9. And would you look at that? That's what I got. And it even gives me the right sign out straight away, which is beautiful. So if you are struggling to answer these just by looking at them, you can use a technique like this. Now, as we move on to the next one, division now, this technique becomes a little different in some ways. So you just got to be careful. So when we come here, you just got to be careful doing these tricks like this when you're dealing with division. And the reason for that is because the order in which you do the division matters. And with multiplication, it doesn't matter. All right. But let's just see if we can do these by inspection. So again, ignore the signs. 24 divided by what will give me 3? Well, I know that's going to be 8. 24 divided by 8 will give me 3. Now, if this is positive and this is negative, this has to be negative in order for it to work. It just has to be. Let's move on to our next one. Here I have 36 divided by what will give me 4. That's going to have to be 9. It's going to have to be 9 there. Now, if this is negative and this is negative, this is going to have to be positive. So I just leave it like that. And then finally here, negative 30 divided by what is going to give me 6? Well, 30 divided by 5 gives me 6. Now, if this is negative and this is positive, this is going to have to be negative in order to get a positive out. So this is going to have to be negative 5, just like that. If we were to use our trick for these examples, what we would end up doing is, because we're dealing with, well, this is where it becomes a little tricky now, and I don't want to get too much into it, but what you would actually do is you would take 24 and you would divide it by negative 3, and that would give us negative 8, and that's what we got there. And that's how you would approach it if you wanted to use that trick, but you've got to be very careful because now things are going to change with this trick if we use this trick down here. As you can see here, what makes this question different to this question is the missing one that we're finding. Like here, the missing one is the second number, but over here, the missing one is the first number. And that's going to impact this thing right here. But don't fear, you actually don't need to know this. You don't need to know this. As long as you can do it by inspection, you're fine. So if you were to look at this and say, what divided by negative 9 is going to be equal to 8? Well, I know that 72 divided by 9 gives me 8. Now, if this is positive and this is negative, this is going to have to be negative. So it's going to be negative 72. Now, you might be struggling with that. You might not be able to, off the top of your head, say that 72 divided by 9 is equal to 8. And that's where this trick comes in handy. But you have to be careful because this time, because the missing number is the first one, what you're going to have to do is take this number and multiply it by this number. And that's going to give me negative 72 there. Let's go on to the next one. What divided by 6 is going to give me 12? Again, that's going to be 72. If this is negative and this is positive, this is going to have to be negative. If you're struggling to come up with that answer, what you would have to do is 6 times negative 12. So I'm taking these numbers and multiplying them. That's going to give me negative 72. And that's what we got there. The last question we have here, what divided by negative 3 is going to give me negative 9? That's going to be 27. Now, if this is negative and this is negative, this has to be positive, so we just leave it as is. If we were to use our trick, we would go negative 3 times negative 9 is going to be positive 27, and that's what we see here. So as you can see, these tricks, you've just got to be careful with them. For the first couple, for the first 3 here, what you were doing is you were doing a division in order to get them. You were dividing the numbers you were given to get it. But then when we came here, so now the first number was missing, we had to multiply them. And the reasoning behind this is very much algebraic, and we'll touch upon it in the equations topic. I just thought I would introduce this little trick to you now, but if you're struggling with it, don't stress. As long as you can do it by inspection, by inspection I mean just looking at it, you'll be fine. Hopefully all that made sense. And you should now begin exercise 1G. I will see you in the next lesson.